Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Shadow break formation. Everything they'd practiced gone in an instant. "Control your dog," someone shouted from the bleachers. Mackenzie Sullivan froze, the familiar tightness gripping her chest. The German shepherd with one deaf ear, the dog everyone had laughed at during registration, was now racing across the arena toward the judge's table. Years of military discipline evaporated as panic surged through her veins. "Shadow heel." Her command cracked in the air. Useless. The crowd's murmurs turned to jeers. She could feel the weight of their stares, the same look she'd endured since moving to Pinecrest with her broken dog. The whispers of that damaged pilot and her disabled dog that followed her through town. But Shadow wasn't stopping. He leaped over the barrier, ignoring the gasps and shouts, making a beeline for Judge Harrington. In that moment, before anyone understood what was happening, Mackenzie saw something in Shadow's determined stride that made her blood run cold. This wasn't disobedience. This was something else entirely. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The sprawling 15 acres of Last Stand Ranch sat nestled against the foothills of Montana's Bitterroot Mountains, as isolated as its owner. Mackenzie "Mac" Sullivan had purchased the property 3 years ago, precisely because it was miles from the nearest neighbor, the weathered barn, the modest single-story farmhouse with its wraparound porch, and the empty fields where nothing grew but wild grass were all she could afford with her military pension and dwindling savings. At 38, Mac's face carried the weathered lines of someone who'd seen too much. Her once regulation-perfect blonde hair now hung in a careless ponytail, often tucked under a worn baseball cap. The burn scars that snaked up her left arm remained hidden beneath long sleeves. Even in summer heat, she'd been one of the Army's finest Black Hawk pilots, with 12 years of service and 3 tours before the crash that ended everything. 4 years ago, during a dust storm in Afghanistan, her helicopter had gone down. 4 dead, 2 severely injured. And Mac, the pilot who should have died with her crew, somehow walked away with burns, a shattered leg that now housed enough metal to trigger airport security scanners, and an insurmountable fear of heights that made even climbing the steps to her porch a daily battle. Shadow had come into her life through a veterans rehabilitation program. The German shepherd had his own war wounds, deaf in his right ear from an IED explosion that had killed his handler. The shelter had deemed him unadoptable, too damaged for service, too traumatized for a family pet. When Mac first saw him, cowering in the corner of his kennel, something in his wary eyes mirrored her own. "Damaged goods," she'd muttered during their first meeting, running her hand over his alert left ear and the scarred right one. "Guess that makes 2 of us." They lived in relative isolation, their days marked by the routine of caring for the ranch and each other. Shadow slept beside Mac's bed, alert to her nightmares, while she accommodated his single-sided hearing by always approaching from his left. They communicated in a language of shared brokenness, finding in each other what the world couldn't seem to offer either of them: acceptance without judgment, companionship without expectation. But now, the bank's foreclosure notice had shattered their sanctuary's peace. 30 days until they would lose everything. The foreclosure notice sat on Mackenzie's kitchen table like a ticking bomb. She'd read it a dozen times, hoping the words might somehow rearrange themselves into something less final. 30 days, after all she'd survived. She was about to lose the only place that had felt safe since Afghanistan. "What do you think?" "Shadow?" she asked, scratching behind his good ear as he rested his head on her knee. "Think we should just pack up and disappear into the mountains." Shadow's mismatched ears, one alert, one permanently drooping, twitched at her voice. His deep brown eyes held that uncanny intelligence that sometimes made Mac wonder if he understood more than any animal should. The phone rang, piercing the morning quiet. Mac rarely received calls. Most people in Pinecrest had given up trying to include the strange recluse in town affairs. She hesitated before answering. "Sullivan," she answered, military habit dying hard. "Mackenzie, it's Ellen from the VA office. Listen, I was looking through some local opportunities that might help your situation." Ellen was one of the few people who still tried to pull Mac back into the world. "There's a regional K-9 competition happening at the county fairgrounds in 30 days. First prize is $50,000. Mac's eyes darted to the foreclosure notice. $50,000 would cover the bank and keep them afloat for months. "Ellen, you know Shadow's not a competition dog. He's different. I know. But he's still a highly trained military dog, even with his injury. And you were telling me last session how you've been working on commands with him." Working on commands was a generous description for the elaborate communication system they'd developed. With Shadow's partial deafness, Mac had incorporated hand signals, light touches, and vocal commands that played to his strengths. "The competition's open to all former handlers and their dogs. There's no rule saying the dog can't have a disability." "And me?" Mac asked quietly. "Last I checked, they don't let pilots with crippling acrophobia climb into helicopters either." Ellen's silence acknowledged the unspoken truth. Mac hadn't just lost her career. She'd lost her identity. "Just think about it," Ellen finally said. "Registration closes Friday." After hanging up, Mac stepped onto her porch, coffee in hand, watching Shadow patrol the perimeter of their property, a morning ritual neither had missed in 3 years. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks disappearing into clouds. Once, she'd loved heights, craved them. Now, even looking at those distant summits made her palms sweat. That afternoon, against her better judgment, Mac drove into town for her monthly veterans support group. She hated these meetings, the fluorescent lights of the community center, the folding chairs arranged in a too-perfect circle, the well-meaning facilitator with her clipboard and sympathetic nods. But Ellen had insisted it was this or actual therapy, and Mac preferred the devil she knew. Shadow lay at her feet as the others shared their stories. Mac rarely spoke, content to listen and occasionally nod in solidarity. It was as she was contemplating an early escape that she noticed him Blake Thompson. He sat across the circle, ramrod straight in his chair, his gaze boring into her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Blake had been her co-pilot once, early in her 3rd tour. He'd requested a transfer 2 weeks before the crash, citing incompatibility with the commanding officer. In reality, Mac had reported him for taking unnecessary risks during missions, a move that had earned her his undying resentment. When the meeting ended, Mac made for the door, Shadow close at her heels. Blake intercepted them in the parking lot. "Sullivan," he said, blocking her path to the truck. "Heard you might be entering the K-9 competition." Mac stiffened. News traveled fast in small towns. "Maybe. What's it to you?" Blake's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just surprised is all." Didn't think you'd have the nerve to show your face or that defective dog in public? He nodded toward Shadow. They have standards, you know, real competitors, not charity cases. Shadow growled low in his throat, sensing Mac's tension. We're not looking for anyone's charity, Mac said, her voice steadier than she felt. Good, because you won't find it. Blake straightened his jacket, revealing the embroidered logo of the competition's sponsor. I've won the last 2 years with Commander. This year makes 3. He gestured to his truck where a perfect German Shepherd sat at attention in the passenger seat. Best of luck, though. Maybe they'll have a special participation ribbon for the disabled division. As he walked away, Mac felt something she hadn't in years, a flicker of the competitive fire that had once driven her to become one of the few female helicopter pilots in combat operations. The same determination that had kept her alive when the crash should have killed her. That evening, Mac spread the competition paperwork across her kitchen table. The rules were intimidating obstacle courses, command execution, scent tracking. Competitors would be judged on precision, time, and the working relationship between handler and dog. What do you think, boy? She asked, as Shadow pressed against her leg. Want to show them what a one-eared dog and a grounded pilot can do? Shadow's tail thumped against the floor. The registration form asked for any special accommodations needed. Mac's pen hovered over the space. Admitting her limitations felt like surrender. But pretending they didn't exist wasn't an option either. Handler experiences severe acrophobia, she wrote. Then added, dog deaf in right ear. Putting their vulnerabilities on paper made her stomach knot. But as she sealed the envelope, a strange sense of defiance replaced her anxiety. Let them see. Let them know exactly what they were dealing with. She and Shadow had nothing to hide and nothing to lose except her ranch, her sanctuary, her last chance at peace. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Shadow's warm weight pressed against her side. Mac made a decision. They would enter the competition not despite their brokenness, but because of it. Because sometimes the things that had been shattered and imperfectly mended were stronger at the broken places. 3 weeks before the competition, Mac stood in the middle of her pasture, the morning sun warming her back as she faced Shadow. The German Shepherd watched her intently, his good ear perked forward, his scarred one half raised in effort. "Okay, boy," she said, raising her hand. "Let's try the sequence again." The makeshift obstacle course she'd constructed from farm equipment and scrap wood looked amateur compared to the professional setups they'd face. But it would have to do. Shadow's training as a military dog gave him an edge in obedience and focus, but competition work required a different precision. Mac brought her hand down sharply. Forward. Shadow sprang into action, weaving through the poles she'd hammered into the ground, his movements fluid despite his compensation for his partial deafness. When he reached the end, he turned, awaiting her next command. "Good boy," she called, giving both verbal praise and the hand signal they'd developed. "Now, over." The jump was modest, only 2 feet high, but it was a start. Shadow cleared it easily, landing with athletic grace. For 2 hours, they worked through commands, Mac adjusting her signals until Shadow responded perfectly, regardless of which side she stood on. By the end, they were both exhausted but satisfied. Shadow flopped onto the grass, tongue lolling, while Max sank down beside him. "We might actually have a shot," she murmured, running her hand along his flank. The preliminary qualifying round was held the following Saturday at the county fairgrounds. Mac's stomach churned as she pulled into the parking lot. It had been years since she'd been around this many people, and the bleachers that surrounded the competition arena stood at least 15 feet high, not towering by normal standards, but a nightmare for someone with her condition. "Just breathe," she reminded herself, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles whitened. "You've survived worse." Shadow whined softly from the passenger seat, sensing her distress. His warm muzzle nudged her arm, pulling her back from the edge of panic. "I'm okay, boy," she assured him, though they both knew it was a lie. The registration table was surrounded by competitors, men and women with sleek, perfect dogs at their sides. German shepherds, Malinois, border collies, all groomed to perfection, all standing at disciplined attention. Shadow, with his scarred ear and the slight tilt of his head that compensated for his hearing loss, immediately drew stares. "Name?" asked the volunteer, not looking up from her clipboard. "Mackenzie Sullivan. And this is Shadow." The woman glanced up, her eyes widening slightly as she took in the German shepherd's appearance. "Oh, you're—" She checked her list, her expression shifting to something between pity and discomfort. "Right. The team with the special needs." Mac's jaw tightened. "We have accommodations listed?" "Yes." "Well," the woman said, handing her a number, "you'll be judged the same as everyone else?" Her tone suggested this was both a warning and a courtesy. As they made their way toward the waiting area, Mac felt the weight of eyes following them. Whispers trailed in their wake. "Is that dog deaf? Look at that ear. Isn't that the pilot who crashed? What are they doing here?" Shadow pressed closer to her leg, his body warm against her calf. The gesture, meant to comfort her, only highlighted their mutual dependence. They were a pair of misfits in a world that valued perfection. The qualifying round required each team to perform a basic obedience routine: heeling, sitting, staying, and retrieving on command. Simple enough for a trained dog, but the arena's setup presented an immediate challenge. Competitors and their dogs had to climb a short set of stairs to reach the elevated platform where the routine began. 6 steps, perhaps 4 feet off the ground, perhaps, for most, an afterthought. For Mac, it might as well have been a mountain. When their number was called, Mac approached the stairs, Shadow at her side. The first step wasn't so bad. The second brought a tightening in her chest. By the third, her vision had begun to narrow, the edges darkening as her breath came in short, shallow gasps. "Ma'am?" The judge's voice seemed to come from far away. "Ma'am, you need to complete the approach to begin your routine." Shame burned through her panic. She was going to fail before they even started. The murmurs from the audience grew louder. Then she felt it. Shadow's weight against her legs, pressing firmly, grounding her. His training as a support animal had kicked in, sensing her distress. Mac forced herself to focus on him, on the solid reality of his presence. One more step, another. Shadow matching her pace, his body positioned to catch her if she faltered. They reached the platform, Mac's legs trembling but holding. The judge, a tall, stern-faced man with silver hair and a military bearing, looked down at his clipboard. Mackenzie Sullivan and... He paused, frowning. Shadow? His gaze lingered on the dog's scarred ear. Are you ready to begin? Mac managed a nod, still working to control her breathing. Very well. You may start when ready. Despite her lingering panic, their routine went flawlessly. Shadow responded to every command, compensating for his deafness with heightened attention to Mac's gestures and expressions. When the final retrieve was complete, a smattering of surprised applause came from the audience. The judge made a few notes, his expression unreadable. Thank you. Ms. Sullivan, you may exit the arena. Going down the stairs proved even harder than going up. By the time they reached solid ground, Mac was lightheaded from hyperventilation. She guided Shadow to a quiet corner, sinking onto a bench. Sullivan. She looked up to find the silver-haired judge standing over her, clipboard in hand. Judge Harrington, she read from his name badge. I'll be direct, he said, his voice clipped. Your dog performed adequately, but your obvious physical distress is a liability. This competition tests the handler as much as the animal. I'm aware of that, sir. Then you're aware that a handler who can barely climb 6 steps isn't qualified to guide a dog through a professional course. His eyes narrowed. Your application mentioned acrophobia. You should have disclosed the severity. With all due respect, sir, we completed the routine as required. Harrington's jaw tightened. Technically, yes. But this isn't about technicalities. It's about standards. He glanced at Shadow. And frankly, both you and your dog fall short. The words stung like a physical blow. Before Mac could respond, a woman's voice cut through the tension. Actually, Bill, the ADA might have something to say about that assessment. They both turned to see a woman approaching tall, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing a competition staff badge that read, Dr. Rebecca Miller, Behavioral Consultant. This is a competition. Rebecca, not a charity, Harrington said stiffly. And the rules state that all qualified handlers and their trained dogs may participate. Dr. Miller countered smoothly. Miss Sullivan and Shadow just demonstrated they're qualified. She turned to Mac with a professional smile. Congratulations. You've advanced to the next round. As Harrington stalked away, Mac found her voice. Thank you. But don't thank me. Dr. Miller interrupted. Your dog is exceptional. The way he sensed your distress and provided support while still performing, that's rare. Her eyes lingered on Shadow with professional interest. Military training. Yes, we both are. I thought so. Something flickered in her expression recognition. Perhaps. Well, you'll want to prepare for the next round. It's significantly more challenging. She handed Mac a pamphlet. Here's what to expect. As Dr. Miller walked away, Mac looked down at Shadow, who gazed back with unwavering trust. Looks like we made it to round 2, she murmured. Against all odds, against all expectations, 2 including her own. 2 weeks before the competition, Mac awoke, gasping for air, her sheets soaked with sweat. The nightmare had been vivid. She was back in the helicopter, the dust storm reducing visibility to nothing, the instruments failing one by one. She could hear the screams of her crew as the ground rushed up to meet them. Shadow was already alert beside the bed, his warm muzzle nudging her hand. The weight of him, solid and real, helped anchor her to the present. This was Montana, not Afghanistan. She was in her farmhouse, not a burning helicopter. "I'm okay, boy," she whispered, though her trembling hands betrayed her. The digital clock read 4:17 a.m., too early to start the day. But she knew sleep wouldn't return. Mac slipped out of bed, pulled on her robe, and padded to the kitchen. Shadow followed silently, his nails clicking softly on the hardwood floors. She made coffee and carried it to the porch, settling into the old rocking chair to watch the first hint of dawn break over the mountains. The competition pamphlet Dr. Miller had given her lay on the small table beside her, its contents memorized but still intimidating. The next round would include a standard obstacle course jumps, tunnels, weave poles, followed by a scent detection test, and finally a complex command sequence, all timed, all executed before judges and spectators. The thought of performing under those conditions made her stomach clench. "We're in over our heads, aren't we?" she asked Shadow, who had settled at her feet. Yet they couldn't quit. The $50,000 prize represented their only chance to save the ranch. More than that, though. Mac realized she needed to prove something, if only to herself. That she wasn't just a wreck of a person hiding from the world, that her life still held some purpose. When the sun had fully risen, Mac changed into work clothes and headed out to the makeshift training area. She'd expanded their obstacle course using lumber purchased with almost the last of her savings. It wasn't professional quality, but it would have to do. For hours, they worked. Shadow tackled each obstacle with growing confidence, his military training evident in his focus and precision. Mac adjusted her commands to accommodate his hearing, positioning herself where he could see her signals clearly. They developed a rhythm, a language of their own, built on mutual trust and understanding. By midday, both were exhausted but satisfied. Shadow sprawled in the shade of an old oak tree while Mac sat beside him, reviewing their progress. "Ms. Sullivan," the unexpected voice made her start. A car had pulled up to the ranch. She'd been so focused on training that she hadn't noticed its approach. "Doctor." Rebecca Miller stood by the fence, her expression apologetic. "Sorry to disturb you," she said. "I got your address from the registration information. I hope you don't mind." Mac rose, brushing dirt from her jeans. Shadow was already alert beside her. Not aggressive, but watchful. "What can I do for you? Dr. Miller. Please, call me Rebecca." She gestured to the obstacle course. "I saw you working with Shadow. You've made impressive modifications to accommodate his hearing. We manage." Rebecca's eyes held professional interest. "I specialize in working with service animals, particularly those partnered with veterans. Your connection with Shadow is remarkable." There was something in her tone and intensity that made Mac uneasy. "We've been together a while," she said cautiously. "May I?" Rebecca indicated the gate. After a moment's hesitation, Mac nodded. She rarely allowed visitors, but her curiosity was piqued. Rebecca entered, moving with deliberate calm as Shadow approached to inspect her. She allowed him to sniff her hand before kneeling to his level, examining him with professional interest. "Military working dog?" she asked, though it sounded like she already knew the answer. detection specialist, Mac confirmed. IED identification, primarily. And the hearing loss. Explosion. His handler didn't make it. Rebecca nodded, her fingers gently tracing the scarred ear. Yet he's adapted remarkably well. She looked up at Mac. As have you. The comment struck too close to home. Mac changed the subject. Did you come all this way to check on our training progress? Standing. Rebecca brushed dirt from her knees. Partially. I'm also here to warn you. Judge Harrington is influential in the competition. He's not pleased that I intervened on your behalf. Why did you? Rebecca hesitated. Let's just say I recognize potential when I see it. Shadow has abilities that go beyond standard training. She tilted her head. You've noticed it, haven't you? His sensitivity to your emotional state? Mac thought of the countless times Shadow had alerted to her panic attacks, sometimes before she herself recognized the symptoms. He's perceptive. It's more than that. Some working dogs develop an extraordinary sensitivity to physiological changes, heart rate, blood pressure, subtle shifts in body chemistry. It's rare but invaluable. She paused. Especially in medical detection. Shadow isn't a medical dog. No, but he has the instincts for it. Rebecca reached into her bag and pulled out a business card. I run a research program studying trauma bonds between handlers and service animals. When the competition is over, I'd like to discuss a possible opportunity. Mac took the card reluctantly. We'll see. After Rebecca left, Mac stood watching the dust settle on the driveway, turning the card over in her fingers. The encounter had left her unsettled, though she couldn't pinpoint why. Something about Dr. Miller seemed too knowing, too interested in them specifically. What do you think, boy? She asked Shadow. Can we trust her? Shadow's response was a non-committal head tilt. The next day brought another visitor, less welcome this time. Blake Thompson's truck roared up the driveway just as Mac was finishing afternoon chores. Shadow tensed immediately, sensing her discomfort. Sullivan, Blake called, climbing out of his vehicle. His German shepherd, Commander, remained in the truck cab, watching alertly through the window. Thought I'd check on my competition. Private property. Thompson. Mac replied coldly. You weren't invited. Blake surveyed the ranch with obvious disdain. Nice place. Shame about the foreclosure. His smile was all teeth. Word gets around. You know. Heat rushed to Mac's face, not embarrassment but anger. What do you want? Just being neighborly. He gestured to her makeshift obstacle course. That what you're training on cute? He took a step closer, his voice dropping. You know, you could save yourself the humiliation and withdraw now. Nobody expects you to actually compete. And miss the chance to wipe that smug look off your face. Not a chance. Blake's expression hardened. You always were stubborn. Sullivan, that's what got your crew killed. The words hit like a physical blow. Shadow growled low in his throat, picking up on Mac's sudden tension. Get off my property, she said quietly. Truth hurts, doesn't it? You pushed that flight when anyone with sense would have grounded it. Blake's eyes glittered with malice. Their blood is on your hands. Everyone knows it. Mac's vision tunneled. Memories of the crash surging back, the alarms, the screams, the sickening impact. Her breathing accelerated, the familiar tightness constricting her chest. Shadow moved between them, his posture protective. The growl deepened, a clear warning. Blake took a step back, eyeing the dog warily. "Call off your crippled mutt, Sullivan." "Leave," Mac managed, fighting to control her breathing. "Now." Something in her face, or perhaps Shadow's increasingly threatening stance, convinced him. Blake retreated to his truck, calling over his shoulder. "See you at the competition. What's left of you, anyway?" As his truck disappeared down the drive, Mac's legs gave out. She sank to the ground, her back against the barn wall, struggling to breathe through the panic attack. Shadow pressed against her immediately, his solid warmth a lifeline. The attack lasted nearly 20 minutes, one of her worst in months. When it finally subsided, leaving her drained and shaky, the sun was beginning to set. Shadow remained vigilant beside her, his head resting on her knee. "He's right. You know," she whispered, stroking Shadow's head. "It was my call, my responsibility." The memories came unbidden, the mission briefing, the weather reports indicating marginal conditions, her decision to proceed despite the risks. The dust storm had appeared suddenly, far more severe than predicted. By then, it had been too late to turn back. She'd fought the controls until the last possible second, managed to level the helicopter enough to prevent a complete nosedive. 2 crew members had survived because of that final maneuver, but 4 others, including her closest friend and co-pilot Sarah Harrington, hadn't made it. Wait. Harrington. Mac froze, the connection suddenly clicking into place. Judge William Harrington. Could he be related to Sarah? The age would be right for a father. The hostility, the immediate dismissal of her and Shadow, it made a terrible kind of sense. That night, she couldn't sleep. If Judge Harrington was indeed Sarah's father, his presence on the judging panel wasn't just uncomfortable, it was potentially disastrous. He would never vote in her favor, no matter how well she and Shadow performed. But withdrawing wasn't an option. The ranch, her sanctuary, depended on that prize money. More than that, backing out now would confirm every whisper, every judgment that had followed her since the crash, that she was broken, a failure, responsible. The week before the competition passed in a blur of intensive training. Mac pushed herself and Shadow harder than ever, refining their communication, practicing each element of the course until it became second nature. Despite her fears, they were ready as they could be, given the circumstances. Word of their participation had spread through Pinecrest. Most reactions were predictably negative whispers in the grocery store, curious stares at the gas station, but there were exceptions. Ellen from the VA office stopped by with encouragement and homemade cookies. The elderly man who ran the feed store offered a discount on Shadow's food, saying simply, "My son served. I respect what you're doing." 3 days before the competition, a small article appeared in the local newspaper. The headline read, "Disabled veteran and one-eared dog enter elite competition." The tone was patronizing at best, painting them as inspirational underdogs rather than serious competitors. The reporter had even included a quote from Blake Thompson. "It's nice to see everyone getting a chance, even if they can't really compete at this level." Mac tossed the paper into the recycling bin without finishing the article. The day before the competition, she received an unexpected call from Dr. Miller. "Just checking in," Rebecca said. "How's the training going?" "Fine," Mac replied. not elaborating. Listen, I wanted to give you a heads up. The course tomorrow includes an elevated platform section, 6 feet high. Mac's stomach dropped. 6 feet might as well have been 60 to someone with her condition. That wasn't in the pamphlet. Late edition, Rebecca said. Judge Harrington suggested it. Of course he had. Thanks for the warning. Mackenzie? Rebecca's voice softened. I've been researching you, your service record, the accident, and your connection to Judge Harrington. So her suspicion had been correct. Sarah was his daughter. Yes, and he blames you for her death. A pause. He doesn't know I'm telling you this, but I thought you should be prepared. After hanging up, Mac sat on the porch steps, watching Shadow patrol the perimeter of the property in the fading light. 6 feet? An insurmountable height for someone who couldn't even climb a stepladder without panicking. What do you think? Shadow, she called. Should we just forfeit now? Save ourselves the humiliation? Shadow abandoned his patrol to trot back to her side, pressing his warm body against her leg. His one good ear perked forward as if to say, I'm listening. Yeah, I know, she sighed, scratching behind his ears. Running away is what everyone expects us to do. That night, she dreamed not of the crash, but of flying, the exhilaration of soaring above the earth, the freedom she'd once loved, in the dream. Shadow sat beside her in the cockpit, his scarred ear flapping in the wind, his eyes alight with the same joy she felt. She woke with tears on her cheeks, the phantom sensation of flight lingering. For the first time in years, the memory hadn't filled her with terror, but with a bittersweet ache for what she'd lost. The morning of the competition dawned clear and cool. Mac loaded Shadow into her truck before sunrise, the eastern sky just beginning to lighten. She'd barely slept, her mind cycling through all the ways today could go wrong. But beneath the anxiety was something else, a stubborn determination that had once been the core of her identity. As she drove toward the county fairgrounds, she glanced at Shadow in the passenger seat. Just so we're clear, she told him. We're probably going to fail spectacularly today. Shadow's tail thumped against the seat. But we're going to do it on our terms, and we're going to make damn sure no one forgets us. The fairgrounds were already bustling when they arrived. Competitors warmed up their dogs in the practice area, spectators filed into the bleachers, and vendors set up booths selling everything from dog treats to training equipment. Mac kept her head down, avoiding eye contact as she led Shadow to the registration table. The same volunteer from the preliminary round checked them in, her expression a mixture of surprise and discomfort. You're in Group C, she said, handing Mac a number. You'll compete after the lunch break. As they made their way to the competitors' area, Mac caught sight of Blake and Commander, already drawing admiring crowds with a flawless practice routine. Beyond him, she spotted Judge Harrington in conversation with other officials, his silver head bent toward them, gesturing emphatically. Dr. Miller appeared at her elbow. Nervous. Terrified, Mac admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. Rebecca nodded. Good. Fear keeps us sharp. She glanced toward the judges. Harrington's been lobbying to have you disqualified on technicalities, but he's been overruled. The other judges are curious to see what you and Shadow can do. even if I have a panic attack on the 6-foot platform." "Especially then," Rebecca said, her eyes twinkling. "Nothing draws a crowd like potential disaster." Despite herself, Mac laughed a rusty sound she barely recognized. "Thanks for the vote of confidence." As Rebecca moved away to attend to her duties, Mac knelt beside Shadow, bringing her face level with his. "Here's the deal," she said quietly. "We do our best. We show them what we can do. And whatever happens, we walk out of here with our heads high." She pressed her forehead briefly against his. "You and me against the world." "Right." Shadow's warm tongue lapped at her cheek, once his version of a solemn oath. Around them, the fairgrounds continued to fill with spectators, the buzz of excitement growing as the competition's start time approached. In less than 4 hours, they would face their greatest challenge, yet a test not just of skill, but of courage, of their ability to overcome not only the obstacles on the course, but the deeper ones they carried within. The midday sun beat down on the competition arena, intensifying the nervous energy that hummed through the air. Mac stood at the edge of the competitors' area, watching as Blake and Commander completed their run to thunderous applause. Their performance had been flawless, every jump precise, every command executed with military perfection. Commander moved like a shadow of Blake's will, anticipating commands almost before they were given. "And that's a score of 98.7 for Blake Thompson and Commander," the announcer's voice boomed over the loudspeakers. "Currently in first place." Blake exited the arena with a confident wave to the crowd, catching Mac's eye as he passed. "Try to at least stay on your feet, Sullivan," he murmured, just loudly enough for her to hear. Mac's stomach twisted as she surveyed the course. The standard obstacles, jumps, tunnels, weave poles she and Shadow could handle. But the elevated platform loomed in the center of the arena, a 6-foot-high wooden structure with a narrow walkway. Competitors were required to guide their dogs across it while standing on top themselves. 6 feet, for someone with her condition. It might as well have been the edge of a skyscraper. Group C, Competitor 4, Mackenzie Sullivan and Shadow. Please report to the starting position. The announcement sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through her veins. Shadow, sensing her tension, pressed closer to her leg. "Ms. Sullivan." A young assistant approached, clipboard in hand. "You're up next." Mac nodded, her throat too dry for words. She led Shadow to the entrance gate, where Dr. Miller waited with an encouraging smile. "Remember," Rebecca said quietly, "the rules allow for reasonable accommodations. If the platform becomes too much, no accommodations." Mac interrupted. "We do this like everyone else, or not at all." Rebecca studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Your choice. Good luck." As they entered the arena, the crowd's chatter subsided into curious murmurs. Mac felt the weight of hundreds of eyes following them, judging them, waiting for them to fail. The judge's table came into view, and there sat William Harrington, his expression stony as he watched their approach. The starter nodded to her. "Whenever you're ready, Ms. Sullivan." Mac took a deep breath, centering herself. The familiar tightness had already begun in her chest, her heart racing with the beginning of panic. But Shadow was steady beside her, his presence an anchor. She placed her hand on his head briefly, drawing strength from his unwavering trust. "Forward," she commanded, dropping her hand in the signal they'd practiced countless times. Shadow moved out ahead of her, alert and focused. They approached the first obstacle, a series of jumps arranged in a zigzag pattern. Shadow cleared each one with athletic grace, compensating for his hearing by watching her hand signals with intense concentration. The crowd's murmurs shifted, surprise evident in their tone. Whatever they had expected from the disabled duo, it hadn't been this level of precision. Next came the weave pole's 12 slender posts that Shadow needed to navigate in a serpentine pattern. This was where his hearing disadvantage might show most clearly, as most handlers used verbal cues to time the weaving motion. But Mac had developed a system of subtle body movements to guide him, and Shadow responded perfectly, weaving through the poles with fluid efficiency. A smattering of applause broke out as they completed the section without error. Mac allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. They were performing well better than their practice runs. Even Shadow seemed energized by the crowd, his movements sharper, more focused. Then they reached the tunnel, a 15-foot fabric chute that Shadow needed to navigate through darkness. This had been problematic in training, without being able to hear Mac's voice clearly while inside. Shadow sometimes hesitated, but today he plunged in without hesitation, emerging from the other end in perfect position for the next obstacle. The crowd's response grew warmer, the applause more genuine. Mac caught glimpses of surprised expressions in the stands, even at the judges' table. Several officials were nodding appreciatively. Only Harrington remained impassive, his pen hovering over his score sheet. 3/4 of the course completed without error. Their time was good, not as fast as Blake's, but respectable. The final section loomed ahead, the elevated platform, followed by a complex retrieval exercise. Mac's steps slowed as they approached the wooden structure. A simple staircase of 6 steps led to the platform, which stood 6 feet above the ground. From there, a narrow walkway extended 8 feet before another staircase descended. Handler and dog were required to cross together, demonstrating control at elevation. Her vision began to tunnel, the edges darkening as her breathing quickened. The symptoms of panic were familiar, the constriction in her chest, the lightheadedness, the trembling in her limbs, but she forced herself forward, 1 step, another. Shadow stayed close, his body occasionally brushing against her leg in a gesture that was both reassuring and supportive. She reached the base of the stairs and looked up. The platform seemed to sway in her vision, though she knew it was solid. The crowd had gone oddly quiet, as if collectively holding its breath. They could see her hesitation, her struggle. This was the moment they'd been waiting for, the broken pilot's inevitable failure. "Come on, Sullivan," a voice called from the stands. Mac glanced up, startled. Ellen from the VA office stood in the bleachers, hands cupped around her mouth. "You've got this." The unexpected support broke through her paralysis. Mac placed her foot on the first step, gripping the handrail with white knuckles. Shadow moved with her, matching her painfully slow pace. Second step. Third. Each one brought a fresh wave of vertigo, her body screaming at her to retreat to safety. By the 4th step, she was hyperventilating, her vision sparkling at the edges, but Shadow pressed against her, his solid warmth a reminder that she wasn't alone. 5th step. 6th. And then they were on the platform, 6 feet above the ground. Mac stood frozen, unable to move forward or back. The crowd, the judges, the entire competition faded away as her world narrowed to the wooden boards beneath her feet and the terrifying space between her and the ground. Her legs trembled violently, threatening to buckle. "Sullivan," Judge Harrington's voice cut through her panic, "you must complete the obstacle or forfeit." She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The helicopter crash flashed through her mind, the sickening drop, the impact, the screams. Her crew, Sarah, their blood on her hands. Shadow whined softly, nudging her hand through the fog of panic. Mac looked down at him, his mismatched ears, one alert, one permanently damaged, his intelligent eyes fixed on her with complete trust. He believed in her, even when she couldn't believe in herself. "Forward," she whispered, the command barely audible. "Together." They began to cross the narrow walkway, one excruciating step at a time. Shadow matched her pace exactly, never pulling ahead despite his obvious confidence at the height. The crowd had begun to cheer now, witnessing her struggle and her determination to continue despite it. When they finally reached the far staircase and descended to solid ground, Mac's legs nearly gave out with relief. The applause was genuine now, appreciative of the courage it had taken to face her fear so publicly. Only the retrieval exercise remained. Shadow needed to select and retrieve a specific scented object from among several identical items. Child's play for a former detection dog, Mac sent him forward with a hand signal, her voice still unsteady from the platform ordeal. Shadow trotted to the array of canvas pouches, sniffing each one methodically. He selected the correct pouch without hesitation, carrying it back to Mac with his tail held high. "Finish," the timer called. The crowd erupted in cheers, not the polite applause of earlier, but genuine enthusiasm. Mac knelt beside Shadow, embracing him as he wriggled with excitement, sensing their success. "And that's a score of 94.5 for Mackenzie Sullivan and Shadow," the announcer proclaimed. "Currently in third place, out of 20 competitors. They stood in medal position with only 5 runs remaining. It wasn't first, but it was far better than anyone, including Mac herself, had expected." As they exited the arena, Dr. Miller met them with a broad smile. "Exceptional work," she said, her eyes bright with professional interest. "Particularly Shadow's responsiveness to your distress on the platform. That's not standard training." "It's not training at all," Mac admitted, still catching her breath. "It's just us, how we work together. Even more remarkable. Then—" Blake pushed past them, his expression dark. "Enjoy your moment. Sullivan, no way you're keeping that position with the precision round coming up." The precision round she'd almost forgotten. The top 5 competitors would advance to a final challenge, demonstrating complex commands and off-leash control. If they maintained their position, she and Shadow would qualify. For the next hour, Mac watched anxiously as the remaining competitors completed their runs. Shadow dozed at her feet, seemingly unconcerned with the outcome. 2 more dogs posted excellent scores, bumping them down to 5th place, the final qualifying position for the precision round. Finalists for the precision round, the announcer's voice boomed. Please report to the briefing area in 15 minutes. Mac led Shadow to the designated area, where the other finalists were already gathering. Blake stood at the center of the group, Commander sitting attentively at his side. He barely acknowledged Mac's arrival, too busy accepting congratulations from fellow competitors. Judge Harrington entered, distributing folders containing the precision round instructions. When he reached Mac, he hesitated, his jaw tight. "Ms. Sullivan?" he said stiffly, handing her the folder without meeting her eyes. Mac took it with equally rigid formality. "Judge Harrington." The tension between them was palpable, drawing curious glances from the other competitors. But Harrington moved on without further comment, continuing his distribution of materials. The precision round would be held after a 30-minute break, giving handlers time to review the requirements. Mac found a quiet corner to study the instructions. Shadow settled beside her. The challenge was daunting, a complex sequence of commands requiring perfect timing and communication. Dogs would work primarily off-leash, demonstrating their response to voice, hand signals, and whistle commands. Distance control was emphasized, with handlers required to direct their dogs from up to 50 feet away. Under normal circumstances, this would play to their disadvantage given Shadow's hearing impairment. But they had developed their own silent communication system. Relying on visual cues and subtle body language, it might actually work in their favor. Mac was reviewing the pattern for the third time when she noticed Shadow's change in demeanor. His head came up sharply, his attention fixed on something across the preparation area. Mac followed his gaze to the judge's table, where Harrington was engaged in conversation with another official. Shadow rose to his feet, a low whine escaping him. "What is it, boy?" Mac asked. But Shadow's focus remained locked on Harrington. There was something in the dog's posture that she recognized from their years together, the same alert tension he displayed when sensing her panic attacks approaching. Then, without warning, Shadow bolted. He tore across the preparation area, ignoring Mac's startled command to halt. Competitors scattered as he raced past them, heading directly for the judge's table. "Shadow," Mac called, running after him. "Shadow, halt!" But the German shepherd was beyond hearing or heeding commands. He leaped over a low barrier, cutting a direct path toward Judge Harrington, who had turned at the commotion with an expression of alarm. "Control your dog, Sullivan," Blake shouted from behind her. The crowd had noticed the disruption, heads turning toward the unfolding chaos. Mac's heart pounded as she pursued Shadow, horrified at this public demonstration of disobedience. After everything they'd accomplished, to fail so spectacularly now, Shadow reached Harrington, who had raised his hands defensively. But instead of attacking, Shadow circled behind the judge, pressing his body against the man's legs with unmistakable purpose, the same way he positioned himself when Mac was about to collapse. And then Mac saw it, the slight gray tinge to Harrington's face, the faint sheen of sweat despite the cool air, the barely perceptible sway in his stance, signs she recognized from her medical training in the military. "Judge Harrington," she called, closing the distance between them. "Sir, I need you to sit down right now." "Get your dog away from me," he snapped. But the words lacked force. His breathing had become labored, one hand rising unconsciously to his left shoulder. "You're having a heart attack," Mac said, her voice carrying the authority of her military days. "Sit down before you fall down." For a moment that seemed suspended in time, Judge Harrington stared at Mac with undisguised contempt. "Ridiculous," he muttered, attempting to step away from Shadow. "I'm perfectly—" His words cut off abruptly as his legs buckled. Shadow, still pressed against him, managed to partially break his fall, preventing his head from striking the ground. Mac was at his side in an instant, military training overriding her personal feelings toward the man. "Someone call 911, she shouted, fingers already at Harrington's neck, checking his pulse. It was there, but irregular, his skin clammy to the touch. Classic signs of a silent heart attack, no dramatic chest clutching, no forewarning, just the subtle indicators that Shadow had somehow detected before anyone else noticed. The competition grounds erupted in controlled chaos. Officials rushed forward, spectators stood for a better view, and competitors gathered in concerned clusters. Shadow remained steadfastly beside Harrington, his body language alert but calm. "What's happening?" Dr. Miller had appeared at Mac's side, kneeling beside her. "Silent myocardial infarction," Mac replied, automatically using the medical terminology from her field training. "Heart attack without the typical chest pain. His left arm is showing signs of reduced circulation." She had loosened Harrington's tie and collar, elevating his legs slightly, using a folded jacket someone had offered. "Ambulance. On its way. 3 minutes out." Harrington's eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to recognition as he focused on Mac's face. "Sullivan," he managed, his voice weak. "What are you?" "Save your strength," she interrupted, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the turmoil inside her. This was Sarah's father, the man who blamed her for his daughter's death, who had tried to humiliate her at every turn. Now his life was literally in her hands. The irony wasn't lost on her. A crowd had formed around them, murmuring and pointing not just at Harrington but at Shadow, who remained vigilant beside the fallen judge. Mac could hear snippets of conversation. "How did the dog know? Did you see how it ran straight to him? That's the deaf dog, isn't it?" Harrington's condition was deteriorating rapidly. His breathing became more labored, his pulse weaker under Mac's fingers. The color had drained from his face, leaving it ashen. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool spring air. "Stay with me, Judge," Mac said firmly, squeezing his hand. "Ambulance is almost here." His eyes, clouded with pain, fixed on hers. "Sarah," he whispered. The name hit Mac like a physical blow. For a moment, she was back in Afghanistan, the helicopter spinning out of control. Sarah's voice on the comms the last words before impact. "Mac, pull up." "Pull." Shadow's warm muzzle against her arm pulled her back to the present. The dog had sensed her momentary lapse, her slide into memory and guilt. His brown eyes met hers, steady and grounding. "Sarah was the best co-pilot I ever had," Mac said quietly, returning her attention to Harrington. "She saved 2 lives that day with her last actions." Harrington's eyes widened slightly, a question in them that he lacked the strength to voice. "She diverted power to the emergency systems," Mac continued, monitoring his pulse as she spoke. "Gave us just enough control for a partial landing instead of a nosedive. Wilson and Martinez survived because of her." A tear slid from the corner of Harrington's eye, tracking a path down his temple. Whether from pain or emotion, Mac couldn't tell. The wail of sirens announced the ambulance's arrival. Paramedics pushed through the crowd with practiced efficiency, equipment ready. Mac quickly briefed them on Harrington's condition and the intervention she'd already performed. They nodded appreciatively at her medical knowledge, transferring the judge to a gurney with swift, practiced movements. "You riding with him?" one paramedic asked, clearly assuming she was family. Before Mac could correct him, Harrington's hand shot out, grasping her wrist with surprising strength. "Yes," he whispered, the single word clearly painful to produce. Caught off guard. Mac glanced at Shadow, then at Dr. Miller, who had remained nearby. "My dog. I'll take care of him," Rebecca assured her. "Go." The decision made for her. Mac climbed into the ambulance beside Harrington's gurney. Shadow watched through the closing doors, his mismatched ears alert, head tilted in that distinctive way that had once been a sign of his injury, but now seemed a mark of his unique perception. As the ambulance pulled away, sirens blaring, Mac found herself in the surreal position of holding the hand of a man who had despised her, whose daughter's death weighed on her conscience like a physical burden. The paramedics worked around her, attaching monitors, administering medication, radioing ahead to the hospital with Harrington's vitals. "BP dropping," one announced. 80/50. O2 sat 89%. Starting IV nitroglycerin. The clinical exchanges provided a strange comfort to Mac, the familiar language of emergency medicine, the ordered response to chaos. This, at least, she understood. Here, her training had value. Harrington's grip on her hand remained surprisingly strong, despite his weakening condition. His eyes, when they occasionally flickered open, sought hers with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. There was something he wanted to say, some communication he was struggling to convey. "Hang in there, Judge," she encouraged, defaulting to the formal title rather than his name. "We're almost at the hospital." His lips moved, but the oxygen mask muffled his words. Mac leaned closer, straining to hear. "Not your fault," he managed, each word a clear effort. The simple statement struck her with unexpected force. After years of carrying the weight of those deaths, of seeing accusation in every face that recognized her name, to hear those words from Sarah's father himself was overwhelming. "Sir, please conserve your strength," she said, her voice unsteady. Harrington's eyes closed again, his breathing becoming more labored. The monitor attached to his chest began to emit a warning tone, capturing the paramedic's immediate attention. "V-fib," one called out. "Charging defibrillator." Mac found herself pushed aside as they prepared to shock Harrington's heart. The ambulance swayed as it took a corner at speed, the driver navigating through traffic with urgent precision. "Clear." The paramedic applied the paddles to Harrington's chest. His body arched with the shock, then settled back onto the gurney. The monitor continued its ominous alarm. Again, clear. Another shock. This time, the erratic rhythm on the monitor stabilized somewhat, though it remained dangerously abnormal. "We're losing him," the paramedic said grimly. 2 minutes to hospital. 2 minutes that could determine whether Sarah's father lived or died. 2 minutes that suddenly seemed of monumental importance to Mac, though she couldn't have explained why. This man had tried to humiliate her, had blamed her for his daughter's death. By any rational measure, his fate shouldn't matter to her personally. Yet it did. "Judge Harrington," she said, leaning close to his ear. "William, Sarah wouldn't want you to give up, fight for her. His eyelids fluttered at the mention of his daughter's name. The monitor showed a slight improvement in his heart rhythm. That's it, she encouraged. Think about Sarah. She was so proud to serve with you as her father. She told me that every day. This was stretching the truth. Sarah had mentioned her father occasionally, always with respect, but also with a hint of the complicated relationship they shared. But Mac sensed that right now, Harrington needed a reason to fight, a connection to hold on to. "We're here," the driver called back. The ambulance slowed as it approached the emergency entrance, where a trauma team already waited. Everything accelerated into a blur of activity. The rear doors burst open, the gurney was lowered and whisked into the building, medical terminology flying between the paramedics and the hospital staff. Mac followed, swept along in their wake, still processing the extraordinary turn of events that had brought her here. In the harsh fluorescent light of the emergency department, Harrington looked older, more vulnerable, no longer the intimidating judge, but simply an aging man fighting for his life. The trauma team surrounded him, working with the practiced coordination of professionals accustomed to crisis. "Family, Mum?" a nurse asked, appearing at Mac's side. "No, she hesitated. What was she? Exactly. I was with him when it happened, at the dog competition." "Wait here," the nurse instructed, gesturing to a small alcove with chairs. "Someone will update you when they can." Left alone, the adrenaline that had carried Mac through the crisis began to ebb, leaving her shaky and disoriented. She sank into a chair, suddenly aware of how far she was from Shadow, her anchor, her support through every panic attack and flashback since Afghanistan. Without him, the hospital's beeping monitors and antiseptic smell began to trigger memories of her own medical evacuation after the crash. Her breathing quickened, the familiar tightness constricting her chest. The fluorescent lights seemed to intensify, too bright, too harsh. The walls of the small waiting area began to close in around her. Panic attack, coming fast. She fumbled in her pocket for her phone, thinking to call Dr. Miller, to check on Shadow, to ground herself in some way. But her trembling fingers couldn't manage the simple task. The phone clattered to the floor as darkness crept in at the edges of her vision. "Ms. Sullivan." A doctor had appeared, chart in hand. "Are you—" He broke off, recognizing the symptoms immediately. "Nurse, I need assistance here." Strong hands guided her to lie down on the floor. Someone placed a cool cloth on her forehead. Voices swirled around her, professional but concerned. "Severe anxiety attack. Get a pulse ox on her. Possible PTSD trigger." The last thing Mac registered before losing consciousness was the irony of it all. She had saved Judge Harrington from his silent heart attack, only to collapse herself in the aftermath. A final, humiliating failure in front of the medical professionals who were fighting to save his life. Shadow, she thought as darkness claimed her. I need Shadow. Mac awakened to the steady beep of a heart monitor and the sensation of something warm pressed against her side. For a disorienting moment, she thought she was back in the military hospital after the crash. Then her vision cleared, and she found herself in a private room, late afternoon sunlight filtering through half-drawn blinds, and against all hospital protocols. Shadow lay beside her on the narrow bed, his head resting on her leg, his watchful eyes immediately registering that she was awake. "Hey there," a familiar voice said softly. Mac turned to see Dr. Rebecca Miller sitting in a chair beside the bed, a tablet computer in her lap. "Shadow," Mac managed, her voice hoarse. "How did he—" "I pulled some strings," Rebecca said with a small smile. "Told them he was a certified service dog, essential to your recovery, which, technically, isn't far from the truth." She nodded toward Shadow, who hadn't moved except to thump his tail gently against the mattress. "He refused to settle until they let him near you." The nurses were quite impressed with his determination. Mac reached out to stroke Shadow's head, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "Judge Harrington." "Stable. They got him into surgery quickly enough to place 2 stents. He's in recovery now." Rebecca set her tablet aside. "The doctors say if he hadn't received immediate attention, he likely wouldn't have survived. Shadow literally saved his life by alerting when he did." The events at the competition rushed back to Mac's shadow bolting across the preparation area. Harrington's collapse, the ambulance ride, her own humiliating panic attack in the waiting room. "How long have I been out?" "About 4 hours. They gave you something to help you rest after the panic attack subsided." Rebecca leaned forward, her expression shifting to one of professional interest. "Mackenzie, there's something I need to tell you about Shadow, about myself, and about why I've been so interested in your partnership." There was something in her tone that made Mac immediately alert. "Who are you, really?" "I am Dr. Rebecca Miller, and I do specialize in animal behavior and trauma research. But what I didn't tell you is that I was also the lead behavioral consultant on the military working dog program where Shadow was trained." Mac's hand stilled on Shadow's fur. "You knew him before?" "Not individually. The program trained hundreds of dogs. But I helped develop the protocols, including some experimental work in physiological detection." Rebecca glanced at Shadow with unmistakable pride. Shadow was part of an elite group trained not just for bomb detection, but for detecting subtle physiological changes in humans specifically, the biochemical markers of extreme stress, medical emergencies, and certain conditions like imminent seizures or cardiac events. Mac looked down at Shadow with new understanding. "That's why he always knows when I'm about to have a panic attack, before I even recognize the symptoms myself." "Exactly." His hearing loss actually enhanced his other senses, particularly his sense of smell. He can detect minute changes in your body chemistry that signal the onset of anxiety or panic. Rebecca hesitated. "But what happened today with Judge Harrington that was extraordinary?" Shadow recognized the early signs of a heart attack in someone he barely knew, someone who wasn't even displaying obvious symptoms. The revelation settled over Mac like a missing puzzle piece falling into place. All those times Shadow had seemed unnaturally attuned to her emotional state, the way he positioned himself when she was struggling, his apparent sixth sense about her needs. It wasn't just the bond between them. It was his specialized training she'd never known about. "Why didn't anyone tell me when I adopted him?" "The program was classified at the time. Most of the handlers who received these dogs were simply told they had advanced training without specifics." Rebecca's expression grew troubled. "After Shadow's injury and his handler's death, he was deemed unsuitable for continued service. The military discontinued that particular training program shortly afterward due to budget cuts. Shadow was just lost in the system." "Until I found him," Mac said quietly. "Until you found each other," Rebecca corrected. Which brings me to the second revelation of the day. She reached for a file on the bedside table. While you were unconscious, a rather unexpected visitor arrived. Judge Harrington's son, Colonel Robert Harrington, flew in from Washington when he heard about his father's condition. The name sent a jolt through Mac. Robert Harrington. He was my commanding officer for my first tour.
Yes, and apparently he's been looking for you since you left the service. When the hospital informed him you were here, that you had helped save his father, he was quite emotional. Rebecca handed her the file. He asked me to give you this when you woke up. With trembling fingers, Mac opened the file. Inside was an official military document, an amended incident report for the helicopter crash that had ended her career. Her eyes scanned the technical language, catching phrases that made her breath catch. Weather conditions more severe than reported to flight crew. Equipment failure confirmed in post-crash investigation. Pilot Sullivan's actions prevented total loss of life. Recommendation: commendation for exceptional service under extreme conditions. I don't understand, Mac whispered, looking up at Rebecca. This contradicts the original report, the one that said I should have grounded the flight, that I ignored weather warnings. Because the original report was incomplete, a deep voice said from the doorway. Mac looked up to see a tall man in an Air Force dress uniform, Colonel Robert Harrington. His resemblance to his father unmistakable, despite being 20 years younger. Shadow immediately sat up at the newcomer's presence, alert but not alarmed. "Colonel," Mac acknowledged, instinctively trying to sit straighter despite her weakness. "At ease, Sullivan," he said, a sad smile briefly crossing his features. "We're long past formalities." He entered the room, nodding a greeting to Dr. Miller before focusing on Mac. "May I?" She nodded, and he took the chair on the opposite side of her bed. "The report you're holding is the result of a secondary investigation conducted 6 months after the incident," he explained. "By then, you had already separated from service and disappeared. Essentially, we couldn't locate you to share the findings." "Which were?" "That you made the correct call based on the information provided to you. The Weather Service had issued an updated advisory that never reached your team due to a communications failure. And the helicopter itself had a previously undetected mechanical issue that contributed to the crash." His expression was grave. "In short, Mackenzie, it wasn't your fault. It never was." The words she had carried for 4 years, pilot error, questionable judgment, preventable tragedy, suddenly lost their crushing weight. Mac struggled to process this revelation, this absolution that came years too late. "Your sister," she began, but couldn't continue. "Sarah," Robert supplied, his voice softening. "Yes. My father took her death the hardest. He needed someone to blame, and the initial report gave him that target." He sighed heavily. "I tried to tell him about the amended findings, but by then he was fixed in his belief that you were responsible. It became a point of division between us. That's why he was so hostile at the competition." Mac realized. He didn't just recognize my name. He's been carrying that hatred for years. "Yes. When I heard he was judging an event you were competing in, I was concerned. But I never imagined." He gestured around the hospital room. "This." Shadow had settled back down beside Mac, his body a warm presence against her side.
Robert's gaze fell on the German shepherd, a question in his eyes. "Shadow alerted to your father's heart attack before anyone else noticed symptoms." Dr. Miller explained. "Likely saved his life by getting attention to him so quickly." "And how did he know?" Robert asked, his tone suggesting he already suspected the answer. "He was part of the physiological detection unit," Rebecca confirmed. "One of our most promising trainees before his injury." Robert nodded slowly. "I remember authorizing that program. Expensive, but the potential applications were significant." He turned his attention back to Mac. "So my sister's former co-pilot and a specially trained military dog saved my father's life today. The irony isn't lost on me." "How is he?" Mac asked quietly. "Stable, awake now. Actually, he's been asking for you." Robert's expression turned hesitant. "If you're feeling up to it, I think there are things he needs to say to you." The thought of facing William Harrington again, this time with the knowledge that his hatred had been based on incomplete information, filled Mac with apprehension. But something else pushed through that feeling. A need for closure. Perhaps an end to the burden they had both carried. "I'll see him," she decided. A nurse arrived to check Mac's vitals, confirming she was stable enough to move around if accompanied. Robert excused himself to inform his father, leaving Mac, Shadow, and Dr. Miller alone again. "There's one more thing you should know," Rebecca said once they were alone. "Blake Thompson was at the competition when Shadow alerted to Judge Harrington's condition." Mac groaned. "Let me guess, he's claiming we disrupted the event deliberately." "Quite the opposite, actually." Rebecca's lips curved in a small smile. "He withdrew from the competition, said he couldn't accept a win after what he witnessed." Blake withdrew. Mac couldn't hide her shock. Blake's competitive nature was legendary. For him to forfeit a certain victory was completely out of character. "He asked me to give you a message." Rebecca's expression turned serious. "He said, 'Tell Sullivan I'm sorry. About everything. She'll know what I mean.'" A third revelation in the space of an hour. Mac struggled to process it all, the truth about the crash, Harrington's change of heart, and now Blake's apparent transformation. It was as if Shadow's dramatic intervention had sent ripples through every broken relationship in her life. "There's something else Blake told me," Rebecca continued. "Something I think you need to hear before you speak with Judge Harrington." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "The day of your crash, Blake was originally scheduled to be your co-pilot. He switched assignments with Sarah at the last minute." The implication hit Mac like a physical blow. "He's been carrying survivor's guilt all this time." "Masked as resentment toward you," Rebecca confirmed. "A common psychological defense mechanism, but destructive for all involved." A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Robert had returned, a wheelchair in tow. "He's ready to see you, if you are." Mac nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of the moment. She moved to the edge of the bed, Shadow immediately positioning himself to support her as she stood. The dog's intuitive understanding of her needs, once a mystery, now explained by his specialized training, remained no less remarkable for having an explanation. With Dr. Miller's help, she settled into the wheelchair. Shadow stayed pressed against her leg, his solid presence a reassurance, as Robert began pushing her toward the recovery wing where his father waited. "Your dog," Robert said, as they moved through the corridor. "Will they allow him in ICU?" "He's a service animal," Rebecca replied smoothly. "Essential for Ms. Sullivan's well-being." Mac placed her hand on Shadow's head, drawing strength from his unwavering presence. They were about to confront the man who had embodied her guilt and shame for years, Sarah's father, the judge who had tried to humiliate her, the patient whose life Shadow had saved. And somewhere in that tangled web of connection and history lay the possibility of redemption, not just for William Harrington, but for Mac herself. 1 week after Judge Harrington's heart attack, Mac stood on the porch of her ranch house, watching the Montana sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Shadow lay at her feet, his one good ear occasionally twitching at the distant sound of birds settling for the night. The peaceful scene belied the extraordinary changes that had unfolded in the days since the competition. The conversation with William Harrington in the hospital had been difficult but necessary. Propped up in his ICU bed, looking smaller and more vulnerable than the intimidating judge she'd faced at the competition, he had struggled to find words at first. Mac had waited patiently. Shadow pressed against her leg, providing the silent support she needed. "My daughter admired you greatly," Harrington had finally said, his voice weak but determined. "I couldn't accept that. Couldn't bear the thought that she had died following orders from someone she trusted." He had looked away, staring at the monitors beside his bed. "It was easier to blame you than to accept that sometimes terrible things just happen." "I blamed myself too," Mac had admitted. "Every day for 4 years. We've both been prisoners of the same moment," he'd replied, a tear sliding down his weathered cheek. "Your dog saw what I couldn't, that I was dying from the inside out. Grief, bitterness, and now this." He had gestured to his heart monitors. "A fitting metaphor, I suppose." They had talked for nearly an hour about Sarah, about the crash, about the years of misplaced blame and pain. By the time Mac had left his room, something had shifted between them. Not forgiveness, exactly, that would take more time, but the beginning of understanding, a mutual recognition of shared grief, and the possibility of healing. Now, a week later, Mac marveled at how quickly life could change course. The bank had granted an extension on her mortgage after a community fundraiser organized by Ellen from the VA office had raised enough to cover 3 months of payments. The local newspaper, which had once published that patronizing article about the disabled veteran and her one-eared dog, now featured a front-page story about Shadow's life-saving detection abilities. Most surprisingly, Blake Thompson had appeared at her door 2 days after the competition, Commander at his side. The 2 men, man and dog, had stood awkwardly on her porch until Mac had invited them in. "I switched places with Sarah that day," Blake had confessed, staring into the coffee mug she'd handed him. "I had a date, something trivial, not even important. She offered to take my place on the flight so I could go." His hands had trembled slightly. "When the crash happened, I couldn't face what I'd done, so I blamed you instead, made you the villain in my story." "We all have our ways of coping," Mac had said quietly. Blake had nodded, finally meeting her eyes. Watching Shadow that day, the way he knew something was wrong when no one else did, The way he acted without hesitation, it made me realize how long I've been hiding from the truth. He had taken a deep breath. I'm re-enlisting, going back to finish what I started, what Sarah and I both believed in. They had parted as tentative friends. The weight of their shared history transformed into something more constructive. Commander and Shadow had even engaged in a brief, playful interaction, two highly trained military dogs recognizing each other as peers despite Shadow's disability. The most significant change, however, had come in the form of Dr. Miller's proposal. Rebecca had visited the ranch yesterday, bringing official paperwork and a vision for the future. I'm establishing a new program, she had explained, spreading documents across Mac's kitchen table. Service dogs specifically trained to detect physiological distress in veterans with PTSD, anxiety disorders, and other combat-related conditions. Shadow has proven the concept more effectively than years of my research. "And you want Shadow for the program?" Mac had asked, a knot forming in her stomach at the thought of being separated from him. "No," Rebecca had smiled. "I want both of you, Shadow as our demonstration model, and you as a trainer. Your connection with him, your understanding of both the military mindset and the reality of living with combat-related trauma. It's invaluable." The offer included a salary substantial enough to keep the ranch, plus the opportunity to help other veterans find the same healing partnership she had discovered with Shadow. Mac had asked for time to consider, but in her heart, the decision was already made. A vehicle coming up the driveway pulled Mac from her reflections. Shadow stood, alert but not alarmed as a familiar SUV parked beside the barn. Judge William Harrington, still moving carefully from his surgery but looking remarkably recovered, emerged from the passenger side. Robert helped his father navigate the uneven ground toward the porch. "Ms. Sullivan?" the elder Harrington called, his voice stronger than it had been in the hospital. "I hope we're not intruding." "Not at all," Mac replied, genuinely pleased to see his improvement. "Come on up. Coffee's fresh." Robert helped his father up the steps, while Shadow watched with that tilted head attentiveness that had once seemed merely a quirk of his damaged ear, but now revealed his specialized training. The dog approached Harrington carefully, sniffing at his hand. "Hello there, fellow," Harrington said softly, a remarkable change from his earlier disdain. "Checking up on your patient. Are you—" They settled in the living room, the men taking the sofa while Mac sat in her favorite armchair, Shadow at her feet. There was an ease between them that would have seemed impossible just a week ago. "I have something for you," Harrington said after accepting a mug of coffee. He nodded to Robert, who retrieved a small wooden box from his jacket pocket and handed it to his father. "This belonged to Sarah. I think she would want you to have it." With slightly trembling hands, Mac opened the box. Inside lay a pilot's wings pin, not military issue, but a small, elegant silver pendant on a chain. She recognized it immediately. Sarah had worn it beneath her uniform, a gift from her grandmother, who had been among the first female civilian pilots. "I can't accept this," Mac said, emotion thickening her voice. "This should stay in your family. You were her friend, her co-pilot, her sister in arms." Harrington replied firmly. "That makes you family in the ways that matter most. He paused, clearly struggling with his next words. I spent 4 years dishonoring my daughter's memory by blaming you for something beyond anyone's control. Please, allow me to begin making amends. The simple sincerity in his voice broke through Mac's resistance. She closed her fingers around the pendant, nodding her acceptance, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Now, Harrington continued, his tone deliberately lightening, Robert tells me Dr. Miller has offered you a position with her new program. News travels fast, Mac observed, gathering her composure. Small towns, Robert said with a smile. But in this case, I'm actually involved with the project from the military side. We're providing initial funding and facilitating access to the veteran community. The Harrington Foundation is also making a substantial donation, the elder Harrington added. I've decided to redirect my retirement toward more meaningful pursuits than judging dog competitions. The Harrington Foundation, Mac echoed, surprised. Named for Sarah, he confirmed. Supporting programs that help veterans heal from invisible wounds, starting with Dr. Miller's project. The synchronicity of it all, how Shadow's dramatic intervention had set in motion this chain of healing and purpose, struck Mac with its beautiful improbability. From isolated, broken survivors to a community united in creating something meaningful from their shared pain. Have you decided whether you'll accept Rebecca's offer? Robert asked. Mac glanced down at Shadow, who looked back at her with those intelligent eyes that had seen her through the darkest moments of her life. I think we will, she said. It feels right. Excellent, Harrington said with genuine pleasure. In fact, that's partly why we came by today. The first training facility will be built right here in Pinecrest. We'll need someone local to oversee the operation. Why Pinecrest? Mac asked, puzzled. It's hardly a convenient location. Robert and his father exchanged a glance. Because you're here, Robert said simply. And Shadow, the program needs to start with its strongest team. As the conversation continued, detailing plans for the facility and the veterans it would serve, Mac felt a sensation she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of rightness, of purpose, of belonging. The ranch that had been her hiding place would become a sanctuary for others like her, a place where broken soldiers could find healing through connection with animals who understood pain and resilience. Later, after the Harringtons had departed with promises to return soon, Mac and Shadow walked to the edge of her property. The last light of day gilded the landscape in soft gold, the mountains standing sentinel in the distance. She knelt beside Shadow, her hand resting on his head, feeling the warmth of him, the steady reality of his presence. We're going to be okay, aren't we, boy? She murmured. Shadow pressed against her leg, his damaged ear and her wounded heart no longer defining them, but simply part of their shared story. They were not broken, but rebuilt, stronger at the mended places, ready to help others find the same healing they had discovered together. As darkness settled over the Montana landscape, Mac felt, for the first time since the crash, the weight of guilt and shame truly begin to lift. In its place grew something new, not the reckless confidence of her youth, but a quieter, deeper courage, the courage to face each day, to climb each mountain one step at a time, to reach out to others despite the risk of pain. And beside her, As always, Shadow watched over her with his mismatched ears and his extraordinary heart. The imperfect companion who had taught her the perfect lesson that sometimes the most valuable gifts come wrapped in damaged packages. Together, they turned toward home. Two wounded warriors who had found in each other not just companionship, but redemption, in a world that too often discards what's broken. Mackenzie and Shadow's journey reminds us that our scars tell our most powerful stories. Remember when we believed our usefulness ended with retirement, with injury, with loss, when the world seemed to move on without us. Like Mac's fear of heights after her crash, or Shadow's damaged ear. We all carry wounds visible and invisible. The child who doesn't call, the spouse who's gone, the career that ended too soon, the health that betrays us. But what if these aren't endings but beginnings? What if our greatest contributions come not despite our brokenness, but because of it? The wisdom earned through suffering, the compassion born from loss, the purpose discovered in starting again. Mac and Shadow found healing not by escaping their trauma, but by transforming it into service for others. They remind us that it's never too late for a new chapter, that our value doesn't diminish with age or injury, and that sometimes the most beautiful connections form between souls who recognize each other's pain. In our imperfections, we find our true strength. In our scars, we discover our most authentic purpose.